Since a childhood, we have watched a lot of spy movies, listened about the intelligence community, and then when I was coming to UK, I thought I should find someone who was in the game.
Spy fiction is not a very accurate guide to real life. It can be very exciting, some of these films. There is this underlying assumption that the Mission Impossible style, they all work. That's not how it happens in reality.
Retired senior heads of intelligence services speak in public about their work, but one who has is Sir David Omand, former head of GCHQ.
What was your perception when you were applying for GCHQ? Like, what is that word?
This is where the world of the 1960s and the world of today are entirely different. Today you could go on the web, you would find GCHQ has a very large web presence. None of that existed in 1969 when I applied. I wasn't supposed to know that I was applying for an intelligence agency, kind of guessed that probably what they were doing, but the rules were very strict.
When you got a job, what was your first day sort of looks like?
The first day is always, I think, going to be confusing for anyone. Gradually the veils are lifted so that if you turned out to have some moral objections to the kind of work, you would then be able to withdraw gracefully.
Does your sort of relationship change people as well? Like, sometimes you cannot trust anyone because psychologically that's how you build over the years.
In a curious way, it's probably the opposite, because to be effective, intelligence officers have to trust each other. Where you're right, I think, is that it's a closed world.
What's the loneliest part of this whole work?
An awful lot of intelligence work is spent waiting. My children were quite small and, I didn't see them for quite a long period. And if you're sleeping in the office and it's very, very high pressured, then obviously the young family begin to question, when's all this going to end?
Example with the 9/11. So what really happened, do you think, in that case?
You've got a number of things coming together. One is straight intelligence failure. Information wasn't shared when it should have been shared. One little example which I think sort of illustrates the problem, which is the report of one of the hijackers who was learning to fly at a US flight school. And the flight school reported this individual was more interested in learning to take off than learning to land.
How did you see the intelligence network of these terrorist groups?
I think it's been through phases. Put together the kind of operation we saw on 9/11 requires quite a lot of information. Today's terrorism is much cruder. It's mostly performative terrorism conducted for the television cameras. It's just going in, buying a kitchen knife, and then being prepared to stab people with it.
How do you see the role of Pakistan, and especially the Pakistan Army and ISI, in the counter-terrorism effort? A special thanks to One Homes for supporting this episode. They are the only developers in Pakistan who are building homes exclusively for the diaspora community. It's important work helping people to stay connected with their roots in a meaningful way. Sir David, thank you so much for taking the time out. It's quite a pleasure, to be honest, because since a childhood, we have watched a lot of spy movies, listened about the intelligence community, and then when I was coming to UK, I thought I should find someone who's really was in the game. So thank you for agreeing for this podcast.
It's a pleasure. I have to say, though, that spy fiction is not a very accurate guide to real life.
Maybe we can start from there, because a lot of people have seen, especially after the Netflix and the rise of Hollywood, especially the last, let's say, 15, 20 years, we have seen a lot of spy movies and the series. How do you see the whole sort of this fictional world where people sort of make perceptions, whether it's a James Bond or my favorite one was the Americans. There was this series from HBO. There are two Russian spies living in the US for 2 decades or something. So how do you see it?
I think you have to identify the things which have to take place for dramatic license. So the cast has to be quite small if you're making it a movie. You can't have 50 or 100 recognizable characters. In real life, of course, it's a team, and you would almost certainly have quite a large number of people backing up a particular operation, for example. Second thing is everything works, or almost everything works in the movies, except when it's deliberately made not to work. And real life isn't like that. You have operations which get postponed and postponed and postponed, waiting for the right conditions. You have technical operations which just don't quite work out, and the technology is a bit too difficult. All of those things are very difficult to portray in film without boring the audience. But perhaps more fundamentally, the world of certainly human espionage is a world in which you have intelligence officers who belong to an intelligence agency, who work, they're state servants, and they recruit agents. And agents are the spies in contact with the information that the intelligence officers are trying to obtain. But of course, you can't really maintain that in fiction without making it look rather bureaucratic. So we talk about spies, and the intelligence officers get branded as spies, although they may be nowhere near accessing directly the information. They're using either technical means or agents that they have had who have volunteered their services. So it's fun. It can be very exciting, some of these films. There is this underlying assumption that plans, this is the Mission Impossible style, they all work. And instantly the hero is able to tap into some computer system or watch the CCTV from... That's not how it happens in reality.
And how did your journey sort of moved into this whole world of intelligence? So when I was researching, you studied very different things, and then you moved into this world. So maybe if you can talk a little bit about how was your childhood? What was your sort of inspirations or aspirations at that time? What do you want to be when you grow up?
Well, if we go back that far, at heart I'm a mathematician. And that's what I wanted to study. I sat the scholarship exam for Cambridge. I switched on advice from my college to economics and statistics, which also has a strong mathematical element, but also is, if you like, a little less abstract. And the more I thought about myself, the more I realized that being a research mathematician was probably not what I was destined to be. So that's why I ended up studying economics and statistics. I then had to find a job when I graduated. The obvious thing would be to work in Her Majesty's Treasury, and I spent a short time there just finding out what it was like to be an economist in the Treasury. Decided I didn't want to do that. I wanted something a little more exciting with a bit more intellectual bite to it. And that's where the university just said, well, why don't you think about these people? And that was GCHQ, Britain's signals intelligence and cybersecurity agency.
So your university recommended sort of...
Yeah,
okay.
Just that you might think about them. Okay. And then, of course, the moment you apply, you then discover that you have to win your place with a very stiff competitive examination.
And what was your perception when you were applying for GCHQ? Like, what is that word? Like, did you have like some sort of a framework or like some stories before that?
This is where the world of the 1960s, I'm talking about 1969 for me, and the world of today are entirely different. Today you could go on the web, you would find GCHQ has a very large web presence, as it does its cybersecurity arm, the National Cybersecurity Centre. You can find out about careers, you can apply for things, you can read about its history. None of that existed in 1969 when I applied. I wasn't supposed to know that I was applying for an intelligence agency. Kind of guessed that's probably what they were doing. But the rules were very strict. And I said there was a competitive examination, much the hardest exam I've ever sat in my life. Then series of interviews, then of course vetting, and then finally I got offered a job.
And how were the interviews? Because you studied maths and other subjects. But in this world, obviously they try to gather a very different perception about a human. So how were the interviews at back then were like?
Well, these days they describe it as being the search for a neurodiverse workforce. They want different kinds of people with different experiences who are capable of working in a team, so you get the best of bringing together very different approaches to the world. They don't want unicultural individuals who may be experts on international relations, for example, but they have one point of view. They want people who have the flexibility of mind, and particularly in a technical agency, if you're trying to solve really difficult problems, you do want a diverse group of minds. There's quite I think 4 times as many dyslexic members of staff in GCHQ than the national average, and that's because people who are dyslexic tend to be very good at spotting patterns and spotting unusual ways of approaching a problem. And you want to team them up with people with perhaps more conventional ways of analysing risk in a situation, and then you can construct really imaginative solutions.
And when you got a job, and what was your first day sort of looks like?
Well, the first day is always, I think, going to be confusing for anyone. And certainly at GCHQ, you turn up in the morning, but of course you don't have a pass to get in. You're ushered through a process which essentially ensures that you know where you're going. You're looked after extremely well. You're equipped with the right kind of passes, given the right kinds of briefings, warnings about the Official Secrets Act, and you sign that, and so on and so on. So it's a rite of passage. But of course, before that, there are 5 interviews, and those are where gradually the veils are lifted, so that if you turned out to have some moral objections to the kind of work, you would then be able to withdraw gracefully. And they would encourage you to do that. I remember when this happened to me, it was very much a question of, now, we want to explain to you, the threats that the nation faces and how what your role would be in trying to uncover details of the armed forces of potentially hostile nations and so on. If that's not the kind of thing you thought you were going to be doing, then perhaps you're in the wrong room and we can have a quiet chat outside. And so it goes on until the point at which they're fully satisfied that you're going to enjoy the work and be able to contribute to it, because it's vital national work.
And when you entered into this world, how did your perception about the world sort of changes? Because there's a lot of information, there's a lot of intelligence, there's a lot of knowledge. So do you think, does it change your perception about the world?
I think it's inevitable that when you lift the hood and you see how these things actually work, how diplomacy works, what is required to support diplomatic initiatives, all the information that's needed to ensure that a fighting force could actually sustain itself, would have some idea of enemy capabilities, for example, all of that information. And you normally, even if you're studying international relations, you probably wouldn't be thinking very much about the information base on which all those activities rest. And that's the role of intelligence. It's to reduce the ignorance, if you like, of the decision maker over what's facing them. And if you succeed in doing that and they've got a better idea of what they face, then over time, of course, they can develop new systems and processes and military doctrines to face up to what it is that you're telling them actually is the potential capability of an adversary.
And after spending like decades in the intelligence community and getting access to such a interesting and high profile meeting with the high profile people, looking at the documents, does your sort of relationship changed with people as well, like close to your circle, your friends and family? Like sometimes you cannot trust anyone because psychologically that's how you build over the years.
In a curious way, it's probably the opposite, because to be effective, intelligence officers have to trust each other, have to be able to work together. And as with the military, as with police officers on operational duties, you rely on your colleagues for support. And you have to be able to trust them that they will deliver that support if it's you that needs it.
But what about your close relationships?
So I think there is I think I understand the point you're inviting me to speculate on, but I first wanted to make that point that a good intelligence agency that delivers the goods is one that has a high level of internal trust. This is one of the things we're talking about, spy fiction. If you read the books of John le Carré, they're very entertaining, they're brilliantly written, but there is this thread of deceit and treachery and letting people down, or even worse, stabbing them in the back. That is not how good intelligence works. So that's an important point to make. Where you're right, I think, is that it's a closed world. You can't go home, as you might if you were an accountant working in a company, and sound off to the family about what an awful day it was and the information wasn't right and you got told off by the boss and all that. You just cannot do that. So there is a sense in which you rely more on your colleagues for that kind of support. And you get very used to the fact that outside work you just don't talk about it.
And what's the loneliest part of this whole work? Because right now it's quite sort of, at least in our part of the world, like it's quite trendy to have a mental health, and like now we have therapists and like whatnot. But obviously back then, if you go back in like 60s, 70s, 80s, these things were not really something, I feel like, which people were focusing a lot and doing this very difficult work. So like what was the loneliest and how were you dealing with that?
Again, coming back to spy fiction, what you can't portray in a couple of hours of film or an episode on Netflix is waiting, and that an awful lot of intelligence work is spent waiting. Waiting for a scrap of information which might allow you to complete the puzzle, which might never arrive. Waiting to see the results, for example, of investigations that you might have suggested need to be made. But then, it could be weeks, could be months before potentially you get a reply, particularly if you're working with partners overseas and you've suggested to them there are things they might like to look at. Are they going to reply? This waiting can be very hard on the nerves. And that, I suppose, is probably where it gets a little lonely. But again, it comes back to you've got a team. So what you don't want are individuals who are cut off from their colleagues and therefore likely to suffer from more sort of mental stress.
And what was the reaction of your family, like when you were in the deep of your work, not just in the start when you get married and you have kids? And obviously for them, that was, I'm sure, was quite fascinating that, and maybe they were telling their friends like, oh, my dad is a spy. What was your reaction to that?
Well, by the time that had happened, I'd moved into the Ministry of Defence. And I was then doing policy work. I was working as Principal Private Secretary to the Defence Secretary, Secretary of State for Defence. So although I still couldn't talk about the work openly, they knew what it was. And they knew where I would be going with the Secretary of State when he went on a visit overseas or whatever. So that makes it very much more natural and easy. I can recall vividly when, during the Falklands conflict, my children were quite small, and I didn't see them for quite a long period. And if you're sleeping in the office and it's very, very high pressured, then obviously the young family begin to question, when's all this going to end?
And like, if we now come to the GCHQ, it founded in 1919. If you explain in a very simple way to a general audience, like what's the role of GCHQ? Because I think NSA, a lot of people, again, because of the news, might know that's the equivalent to the GCHQ. So what's the role of GCHQ?
I think it's easiest just to go right back, as you've just done, to the beginnings. In fact, during the First World War, so the Admiralty, the Navy, had a cryptographic department attempting to decipher German naval communications quite successfully. And the Army had a department of military intelligence that was doing the same on the Central Front in Belgium and France for ground forces facing German ground forces. And this is the first time, I think, that you really begin to see the organisation of this kind of, can we intercept the enemy's signals, communications? If we do, can we read them if they're enciphered? And of course, over time, more and more of them were enciphered. And at the end of the war, a committee with Winston Churchill as one of its members, even as early as that, came to the conclusion that this is a capability we're going to need as a nation beyond the war, and that the Army and Navy departments should come together and create a single unit. It was called the Government Communication Cipher School, GCHQ. Its name later changed after the Second World War to today's GCHQ, but it's the same organisation. My hunch is that after the Second World War, when it's been so successful, the government didn't particularly want the words code and cipher to be in the name of the organisation, so they just called it this rather anonymous name, Government Communications Headquarters, and that's what it is today. It is broadly equivalent to in functions, to the United States National Security Agency. Obviously it's a lot smaller. The US is a very much bigger power. But the functions are very much the same, and we've had a relationship with the US National Security Agency, a very close relationship, since it was founded after the Second World War, and before that with the Army and Navy cryptographers in the United States.
And you have worked quite extensively in GCHQ and with the government. And now when you look back, what are some of the most challenging sort of decisions which you had to make, or those incidents which you feel were quite difficult for you?
Well, I think it's an expensive business, and it was during the Cold War, and it's even more expensive in today's digital world.
And expensive in what way?
Cash, just running it. You need a lot of people. You need a lot of high technology. During the Cold War, you needed the very first supercomputers. So that was really the first large-scale use of large computing power to try and get through the layers of encryption that would be placed on communication, particularly military communications. So a lot of the problems come from how do you justify where you put the resources? Where will the resources be likely to yield the best effect? Of course, at the end of the Cold War, the target set changed. At today's targets, terrorists, the serious criminals of all sorts, cyber attackers these days. And in the last few years, we've seen this resurgence of state threats, which we had not really thought at the end of the Cold War. We thought, well, that we've turned the page on state threats. Well, turned out we hadn't.
And also, like, when you see the intelligence community, like from the Pakistan experience, if I tell, in Pakistan, the intelligence was used quite a lot for the political stuff as well. Do you think in the British intelligence sort of community, it was also sort of like worked in the political system to jeopardize the politicians or like the system?
No, and that risk was identified very early on, and rules were put in place, which then in the 1989 and 1994, the British Parliament passed laws which actually prohibited the use of secret intelligence gathering for political purposes. And it's written in black letter law, as they say. It's very firm. There are only three purposes: national security, the detection and prevention of serious crime, and what's called the economic well-being of the state from external economic threats. And that's all. Those are the only three reasons that you can justify the use of the British intelligence agencies. And there's always been a very scrupulous regard for that legislation. And certainly it would be an instant sacking offence if the director or director general of an agency were to use the material for a domestic political effect or allow a domestic political party access to secret information which might benefit them.
And also, like, we have again heard and seen or read in a lot of newspapers, like in all the intelligence agencies there are rogue elements. There are like obviously there are black ops, that's a different, but like the rogue elements. Do you think in the, like, is that true if you see? And again, if you come to the British intelligence, do you think there were these rogue sort of elements? Is it a natural part of the process?
No, I don't think you have to accept the presence of rogue elements. And it should be your duty, if you're running an intelligence agency, to identify who they might be and get rid of them. Because in the long run, it's very bad for the agency, as well as being unconstitutional. The only British case of any note were the rumours in the 1960s that Harold Wilson, then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, was not reliable in relation to the old Soviet Union. He'd worked with quite a few senior Soviet figures during the Second World War when we were allies. And the then KGB had a file on him, but they never. We now know from lots of sources that they never succeeded in exploiting that in any way. But that was a rumour which a number of disaffected officers, tried to spread. But I may say they were all retired officers. This is not something that originated inside one of the services, and it was dealt with pretty quickly. and there's no truth in it. It would be very, very strange, I think, in the British way of running intelligence, which is about providing key judgments to the decision leaders, from the Prime Minister downwards. Through an interagency process, I spent 7 years sitting on the British Joint Intelligence Committee with the heads of intelligence agencies and senior policymakers from the British establishment, from Whitehall. And it's almost unthinkable that there would be somebody using intelligence for that kind of purpose. But it happens overseas, and we know it happens overseas.
And why do you think it happens like in other parts of the world? Like what's the main reason? Do you think they are emerging nations? Is it like a culturally, like why do you think it happened?
I don't know. Is it associated too with a culture that tolerates a level of corruption? For example, in public procurement. And we know there are a number of countries where, to get a large order probably requires some form of bribe. That's part of a culture which would, I think, make it perhaps more understandable if you had the intelligence agencies involved in that. The part of it may well be about inheriting a tradition. And in the British case, the tradition going back to the First World War is you're providing battle-winning information. And you're staying well away from politics. And the last thing you want is some politician interfering in the professional judgments that are required to gather intelligence and assess it. So you want to stay, in a sense, as far away as you can. There's a lot of controversy in 2003 over Iraq, for example, and allegations were made that the intelligence community was somehow accommodating ministerial wishes to see certain conclusions being reached. In fact, having followed that very closely, given evidence to the independent inquiry, the truth was we got it wrong ourselves. We didn't need political pressure. It was one of those awful circumstances where, for a number of reasons, the assessments were not as accurate as they should have been, which is very regrettable, and all of that is public. But it wasn't because people wanted to please ministers or pass information to ministers they shouldn't have passed to ministers. It was this very difficult question of you have a small number of reports. Do you believe them? Are you guilty of being taken in by deception, deliberate deception from the other side? And in one case, that's certainly what happened to us.
I mean, in the same example with the 9/11, again, the perception was there are a few elements in the CIA who already knew all of these, not all of these, like a couple of the hijackers, and they were not sharing information with FBI because there were few agents from FBI who came on the TV that we were telling the CIA that something is about to happen. And then there was like conspiracy theories, this was an inside job, outside job. So what really happened, do you think, in that case? Was it just a intelligence failure overall?
You've got a number of things coming together. One is straight intelligence failure. So information wasn't shared when it should have been shared. And to share it safely, given its sensitivity, you've got to build structures and train people in how to manage that kind of information and build trust. One of the reasons I created the British Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre was so that representatives of all the agencies and the military and civil departments would all be in the same place with access to their own information technology, and they would learn to trust each other with each other's information. So you would get the widest possible picture of what might be going on by way of a threat, and that's been extraordinarily successful. You can see that was a problem between CIA and FBI, and that was the congressional inquiry's conclusion. But there are other things were going on. A new administration that had priorities which didn't include terrorism, counter-terrorism, and they were anxious to get on with those. So when there were minutes sent in, memos sent in to the White House, they didn't get the attention which after 9/11 they certainly would have done. And that led, I think, the congressional inquiry to what they called the paradox of warning, which is very important, which is that it's quite easy to identify potential threats when you're convinced there is something, but it hasn't yet happened. The temptation is to wait and see, wait for more information, and, of course, to get the political momentum to take big decisions which might stop it. You won't have that political momentum until it's happened, by which time it's too late. And that was the conclusion of the congressional inquiry, because Dick Clark, for example, who was the White House counter-terrorism expert, he was sending in minutes to the White House saying, the threat level of an attack on US interests. Of course, they thought it was overseas. Nobody had seen it domestically. But there's one little example which I think sort of illustrates the problem, which is the report of one of the hijackers who was learning to fly at a US flight school. And the flight school reported, quite properly, that this individual was more interested in learning to take off than learning to land. Now, if you had in your mind the hypothesis of using an aircraft as a flying bomb, that might just stimulate a bit of inquiry. As it was reported, it did get into the FBI. Nobody understood the significance of that, potential significance of that remark. And that illustrates a general point about intelligence work. Unless you have the hypothesis in your mind as a possibility, you're probably not going to be able to put together the little fragments of information you might have. But it's easier to say that than in practice it is to do it.
And how did the world sort of change, and not just the world, but the intelligence world, like intelligence community and generally the intelligence world change after 9/11? Because that was quite a significant event of the decades, we can say.
Indeed, and I can give you an example, which is the year before 9/11, a young man living in Birmingham called Moinul Abedin was discovered to have collected a large amount of material to make homemade explosives in his flat in Birmingham. And he was arrested. And he was charged under the Explosive Substances Act of 1883 because there was no counter-terrorism legislation to charge him under. It was seen locally as a strange thing that a young man should be trying to make homemade explosives, but I don't think it made the front page of the newspaper.
Wow.
Now, if that happened today, there would be immediate front pages about the threat and speculation about what the young man might have been going to use the explosives for, and so on. And I think what that story illustrates is that you need the context. And 9/11 created a particular context. So people could then understand both the potential threats that were arising and what governments were doing to try and prevent them, and put it in a sort of context, a story. But if you don't have that narrative, it's just a strange event and nobody quite explaining what was going on. Some years later, after the intervention in Afghanistan, it was discovered that this young man, it was an AQ plot, and that one of the Al-Qaeda operational planners was actually behind, encouraging him to mount an attack. But that wasn't known at the time, and indeed I don't think Al-Qaeda as a movement, if you like, was really understood at the time.
And I mean, you've talked about Al-Qaeda, and if we fast forward a little bit, so 9/11 happened, and then the whole sort of the next 10 years, the war in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and then like all over the world, like different parts, something was happening. How did, like, my question essentially is, why were we unable to capture one Osama Bin Laden in the early days, Mullah Omar, Ayman al-Zawahiri, and despite having, like, especially for the West, despite having a lot of like technology and money, obviously there was Pakistan there as well supporting, like, where were the lack, like why were we unable to do that essentially?
Well, quite a few books have been written about that, and opinions differ. I put it down to it's bad luck. It's operational planning. It wouldn't have taken very much of a change in operational planning for the intervention itself and the deployment of forces that he would not have been able to retreat the way he did. But whoever was making the plan didn't spot that, and he was able to escape. Of course, he learnt the lesson of anonymity. Multiple times, and that you have to communicate essentially with paper and pencil and couriers. Now that turned out to be his weakness, because eventually, after many years, patient intelligence work uncovered how he was communicating, and that in turn eventually led to his potential identification in Abbottabad. But it might not have been him. There was no certainty at the point at which President Obama authorized that raid.
And again, but then the question would also arise, like, was their intelligence were more powerful than the intelligence of the Western powers? And obviously Pakistan, they were like sort of, in that area, all of them. How is the Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Taliban, how is their intelligence sort of network works overall?
Well, I hesitate to speculate. It was clear that, there were contacts between Pakistani intelligence and various groups. And, if you're in Pakistan and you're looking for the security of Pakistan, of course you keep in touch with a whole range of different groups, including the Taliban. And that, I think, is a matter of public record. So intelligence, you don't have to be handed an intelligence report. Just you can pick up quite a lot about what is going on if you have those sorts of contacts. I wouldn't overestimate the Al-Qaeda's own intelligence, for example, about the United Kingdom. They had a number of operational planners who did know the United Kingdom, or who had at least lived in the United Kingdom. Rashid Rauf, for example. And he did his best to try and organise, promote terrorism in the United Kingdom by UK nationals. The most, two examples. One we called the Crevice Gang, who assembled a very large amount of homemade explosive to make the sort of bomb the Provisional IRA used to use, a fertilizer bomb. And they were eventually uncovered and arrested and put in front of a court and convicted. And the second which must have been 2006, that sort of period, was the liquid bomb plotters. And that was a very serious Pakistan-inspired, or from Pakistan, I don't mean the government, I mean from Al-Qaeda planners in Pakistan, to blow up half a dozen airliners, American airliners filled with Americans crossing the Atlantic, flying from British airports to a whole range of American airports, using a bomb they would assemble on the flight itself. It was very ingenious. The plan was to take soft drinks bottles, drill a little hole in the bottom of the soft drinks bottle, fill it with the components of liquid explosive, leave the cap of the bottle untouched, so it would pass through inspection at customs, and detonate it with one of those a modified throwaway camera, which any tourist would have on them in those days. This is before the digital camera, and it would have worked. It would have worked. The particular mix of explosives and the detonator was tried out on an aeroplane on the ground. It would have blown a hole in the side of the aeroplane. It would have resulted in the deaths of more Americans than 9/11. So you can imagine the global impact which that sort of coordinated, very elaborate plan would have had. Now, the good intelligence work, good cooperation with Pakistani authorities, the patient work of surveying the potential members of the group, identifying who they were, eventually leading to covert surveillance, which could then produce evidence to be used in court. And they were all given long sentences after a proper trial. But that was a close-run thing, and that was a very big, probably the biggest counter-terrorism operation we've run in the United Kingdom. So that's just an example of we rely on preemptive intelligence to try and stop these kinds of attacks. The conclusion that I think the operational planners in Al-Qaeda drew was it was too dangerous for them to try and construct 9/11 type or liquid bomb plot operations involving really quite a lot of people. And of course what we've been suffering from in the last few years is the result, which is the use of bladed weapons, hiring a car, crashing it into a crowd. Several such attacks in Germany, for example. We've had one in the UK. So, if you like, it's become much harder for the intelligence agencies to identify who is the potential terrorist. And with social media, with the way that people are radicalized into violence, if they have a particular mindset and they're thinking that way, and then extreme propaganda is pushed out. And that was one of the problems with the so-called Islamic State, was their ability to produce very high quality propaganda material and push it out through social media.
And how did you see the intelligence network of these terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda or like generally the IS or the Taliban? Do you think they are like very well organized, or is it like a very scattered and just doing things on their own, or is it like a very...
I think it's been through phases. And to put together the kind of operation we saw on 9/11 is very sophisticated. It requires quite a lot of information about what the various operatives, terrorists had to do in order to come together. It requires a lot of good tradecraft to avoid being detected. Today's terrorism is much cruder. It's mostly performative terrorism conducted for the television cameras, rather than with the intent of causing mass casualties, for example. that is much harder, and it doesn't really require sophisticated organisation. It just requires motivation, because it isn't even like building a suicide bomb vest. It's just going in, buying a kitchen knife, and then being prepared to, stab people with it.
And we have talked about the role of Pakistan in the counter-terrorism effort, and the perception of the West is Pakistan sometimes were supporting Taliban, and then they were not supporting, they were doing the operations, they were also killing people, but then supporting. So they're playing on the both sides. How do you see the role of Pakistan, and especially the Pakistan Army and ISI in the counter-terrorism effort? More than 50,000 Pakistanis have been killed over the last 2 decades. So how do you see the role overall?
I'm not the right person to ask, because I haven't been following this in recent years the way I once might have. I think if a nation is suffering serious casualties from terrorism, then the authorities have got to do something. They've got to gather intelligence on those who might be conducting the attacks. They've got to try and explain what is going on and the motivations and so on. And for that, of course, you have to make contacts. You have to understand your enemy. You're also going to have, as I think we've seen, a lot of misinformation. Not necessarily deliberate disinformation, but just information which gets circulated, particularly on social media, and that may or may not have a basis of truth in it. So, my advice would always be to pause, hesitate, don't jump to conclusions. Don't assume that there's a state hand behind every incident. On the other hand, be open-minded about, try and see these things from the other person's perspective. Would it be unreasonable to have this contact or that contact? In the UK, we had very good relations with Pakistani intelligence authorities, and I think we worked to mutual advantage. Does that mean that you wouldn't occasionally possibly have a suspicion? Well, you might or might not, but the main thing is, are you actually doing what's necessary to protect your country, or both countries?
You mentioned about the misinformation and disinformation and social media. How is intelligence gathering is now changing after AI, after deepfake, after especially the last, I think 3 to 5 years, how generally the AI is changing world so rapidly?
Well, the first thing is there's more information around. That's a problem, because unless you have an effective way of filtering it, the risk is that the small number of analysts, which it will always be a small number, simply can't cover everything they should, and they will miss some important piece of information because they're working their way through all the rest of the stuff which is not so important. That's where the potential of artificial intelligence to summarize and to identify significant changes comes in, probably in the area of visual analysis. It's one of the easiest ones to understand, where it makes a real difference. So if you have something under observation, do you have to have a human being watching it all the time, or can you actually program an algorithm so that significant changes will be detected and then will be flagged up to a human operator? And that I'm told is the state of the art on that is now in Ukraine, as you would expect, and lives depend on that. The problem of volume of information remains, though, and it's getting worse. We'll see whether it's possible to filter that effectively with AI. But there are problems still with AI. hallucinates. It all depends on the training data, and if the training data is not adequate, the results won't be acceptable. There's quite a lot for the AI community still to do before you could begin to rely. A classic example at the moment in Europe is there Russian interference in our information space? And it's very difficult to assess that. You can find individual examples where some bots are being used to push particular stories, say during an election campaign. But how significant is it? And for that, given the volume of activity on social media, you've got to use machines. Are they yet reliable enough to be able to take policy decisions on the back of them? Probably not.
And how do you see the national security and people's privacy? Because again, with the AI, with the social media, there is a lot of surveillance on the digital platforms as well. So if you talk to national security people, they said, obviously, this is for your good. But from the people's side, no, but it's a privacy breach. So how to balance it, and like, how do you see it like overall?
Well, when we looked at this, I was a member of an independent commission that looked at this a few years back at the time of British legislation. We came up with what we called the 3 R's. So the first was the rule of law. So can you be really sure that a member of the public, lawyer, can read the law and know where the boundary is of what the agencies are and are not allowed to do, and with what permissions? So that wasn't always the case in the United Kingdom. If you go back 30 years, the law was rather ambiguous, quite difficult to read that legislation and understand what exactly the agencies would be entitled to do. That's been cleared up now with the big Act of Parliament in 2016. The second is regulation. So what constrains the use of these very advanced techniques? A system of warrants, for example. So the most intrusive kinds of surveillance should require quite a high level of clearance before they're allowed to go ahead. How do you know that the clearance system is operating properly? Well, in the British case, we have judges and a judicial commissioner and a panel of judges who have to sign off on warrants which are signed, authorizing intrusive investigation and interception. And then the third is, if you like, restraint. So even though you've got the law written down, you've got handbooks that explain to the intelligence officers what they're allowed to do, you still place, in the UK, we place a burden on the individual to act with necessity and proportionality. It's a restraint. And they could be asked by the judges or by the technical advisors to the judges, explain to me, why is it that you have put that target? You've asked for information from this system using this algorithm on that target. Is it justified? Is it necessary to do that? And do you have a reasonable prospect that it might bring success? So it's not just a random fishing operation in the hope that you'll sooner or later find something of interest. So those 3 sort of ways of constraining, that's the first protection, I think, for the citizen. It won't stop it happening if there's a justifiable reason for it and if there's sufficient authority given to, yes, we need to do this. But it's, I think, a very good reassurance. It's not going to be used for the wrong purposes, political purposes, for example, and it's not going to be used disproportionately. The second line of argument, which I add to it, is that in today's world, the citizen gives more information to the media company,
The social
internet
media,
companies, the tech companies, than any intelligence agency ever could or should know. So we provide all. If you just look at internet searches, for example, and how much they might reveal, all of that information is automatically available to the tech companies. And they use it for programming their advertising. They run auctions on the space on your browser, to choose the advertisement which is best suited to persuade you to buy something. And we accept that system. So given that all that information is already in the hands of the tech companies, is it so unreasonable that some information should be sought and available to government when it's a matter of national security or detecting and preventing serious crime? I don't think it is. And then the third line of argument, which is more controversial, and I would readily acknowledge not everyone agrees with this, is that almost all of the information which is accessed by an intelligence agency is never looked at by a human being, because it's the algorithms that are running over the bulk of data that pick out the things that might be of interest. And it would be totally impossible for any agency, however large, to actually look at it all. So the idea that there are, for example, at GCHQ, rooms filled with people reading your emails, they're not, and they couldn't. The volume is just impossible, quite apart from the law. But what you do have is, in order to access the material you do think you need, you've got to actually collect a large amount, and then run the algorithms over it, scan it, and with luck you might actually get some results which start an investigation or enable you to continue an investigation. So almost all of that data is not actually ever seen by a human being, and it's discarded because the cost of keeping it would be completely disproportionate. You would only keep material if you had a reason why it might contain something of interest. You've got some evidence for that. So an evidence-driven system, and if you put all those together, I think you've got a reasonable assurance to the ordinary citizen that the benefits of giving these powers to the British intelligence agencies far outweigh any potential feeling of that personal information is being wrongfully examined.
You have talked also a lot about ethical intelligence gathering. What does that really mean? Because if you're an agent or a spy, like, your job is to just get, your job done. So, and in this sort of a field, it's really sort of difficult to be ethical. So what do you mean by ethical intelligence gathering?
Well, for me, having an ethical code is a defining characteristic of a profession. So medical doctors have an ethical code. You're not supposed to harm your patients. It's all set out. Lawyers have an ethical code. You're not supposed to embezzle the money from your clients. Scientists have an ethical code. You're not supposed to fiddle the results of your experiments. And acting unethically against your code, in most of those cases, would result in disciplinary action and dismissal or withdrawal of your license to practice. So I don't think the intelligence profession in a democratic country is any different. Obviously, it's a different set of moral codes from those that you would want in the case of the family. After all, intelligence, as you say, it involves stealing information from other people. Secret intelligence is acquiring information which other people not only don't want you to have, but may go to extremely violent lengths to prevent you acquiring, and you normally don't want them to know that you've got it. So you're going to have to be tricky. You're going to have to introduce malware onto a network. You might have to recruit an agent who has access to the information. You might have to intercept communications, and certainly communications data about who called whom, when and where. These are all things which we don't allow the general public to do, but with the right permissions and authorizations, we think it's reasonable for the state's intelligence agencies and the police to have access to. So I think it is that you've got to have that ethical framework. It's still what I described as principled intelligence. And one of the hallmarks of that is that the intelligence officers understand where the red lines are.
Do you think they understand?
Yes.
I mean,
in the case of the British services, they certainly do, and it's a key part of their training and refresher training to be reminded of what the law does and doesn't allow them to do, and what their, if you like, moral code, necessity and proportionality, so right authority. These are all important because the last thing you actually want if you're running an intelligence agency are rogue operators. They will just bring nothing but trouble. These are decisions by, say, intelligence officers operating overseas that may have to be made in very difficult circumstances, circumstances of danger in some countries. And what you want is they can't always be ringing up head office to ask for permission. So you need to have people who have an inbuilt moral compass, who will do the right thing. And that's an important part of the training that's given to British intelligence officers. And in the end, it's, if you like, you judge all this by does it bring in results? And the British experience since, the first days of the First World War is behaving in that ethical way, albeit in a very different, unusual circumstances, but behaving in that way has a higher chance of bringing in results, partly because recruiting agents, for example, the agents choose to be agents of we don't employ blackmail, sexual manipulation or whatever.
But there are techniques like honey traps and things like that. Where do you put those then?
This is a very British point of view, and again, it's backed up by results. It's not about morality here, it's about efficiency, effectiveness. Those methods would very rarely give you results. If you put somebody in a arm lock because you've coerced them into cooperating because you've got some dirt on them, they will spend most of their waking lives working out how they get out of that arm lock. They're most unlikely to put themselves in any way at risk to get you information. Quite the reverse. They may resent deeply having to provide you with information. That's not what you want. What you want is, and the best British case, for example, would be Gordievsky, the KGB officer who volunteered his services and then worked for the British intelligence services from within the heart of the from the heart of the KGB to reveal secrets because he wanted to reveal them, and he wanted to reveal them to his British case officers because he trusted them as people. And the moment you have a suspicion that you might, dispose of your agents one way or another, or not fail to look after them, then you won't get that kind of volunteering. And that's what British intelligence officers are trained to do, is to look out for people where you can form a common interest, for example, against the terrorists, where you can work with someone who will trust you with their security, with their life, in fact, and that you will look after them, and in return they want to help.
And how do you recruit an agent or a spy?
Well,
and also, is it two different things, like a spy and an agent, or is it the same?
No, that's the same thing. That's the same thing. But I'm not the right person to ask because, I come from a technical background, very, very different kinds of work. But a large part of the activity is indeed for British intelligence officers looking for people who want to help, and then building friendships and relationships. It's not about setting up honey traps.
You spend a lot of time in the intelligence community, in the government. What did you learn about the world overall? How is the world running?
At the moment, I think it's not running very well. And that's an obvious thing to say. I think you learn that the world runs better when it is a rules-based order, when there is an general understanding, for example, whether it's over trade, whether it's international relations, whether it's dealing with problems on the border, whatever it might be. If you have a set of international understandings, people, by and large, abide by those, and over time you build up relationships, personal relationships, between different countries, those in authority in different countries. Then it can work extremely well. I worry about the current fragmentation of international relationships. I'm not sure in the long run it will be a good thing. For the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, the United Nations itself, once you start to undermine these institutions because they're multilateral rather than bilateral at heart, then I think we'll all be the losers.
And from a very macro level, do you feel like there's a bit of a hope in the world, for a bit of a peace, because of war in Gaza and then Ukraine and then recently Pakistan, India happened? Is there a hope?
Well, I am an optimist.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always been somebody whose cup is half full rather than half empty. I mean, I'm encouraged that the dispute between India and Pakistan, which led to actions by the armed forces of both sides, was brought to us. Further escalation was avoided. And you can avoid further escalation if both sides recognise that there is a mutual interest in not getting locked into a cycle of the kind that we saw in Europe, before 1914, in which there's almost inevitability that this is going to escalate into full-scale conflict and full war. Who would benefit from that? No one. So having leaderships that are capable of standing up for their countries, of course, defending their interests, but at the same time realizing there is a long-term interest in not getting trapped in international circumstances which might lead to war. And I say I'm encouraged that we're not facing such a situation today over Kashmir.
You recently wrote a book, How Spy Thinks, 10 Lessons in Intelligence. If an ordinary person is listening to this conversation, what are the top 3 things we can learn from a spy, which we can use in our daily lives?
Well, learn from, if you like, the practice of intelligence, including by intelligence analysts. The first is the warning that intelligence is always fragmentary, incomplete, and even with the best agencies in the world, it will sometimes be wrong. And the point here is that if your government uses intelligence sensibly and consistently, it will avoid many of the problems that it would otherwise have. It will come out better. But there's no guarantee. So those who are thinking of using intelligence, this could be down at the level of a business, for example. You just have to remember that what you think you know, it's almost certainly not the full picture, and it may sometimes be wrong. The second thing is about explanation. Data is meaningless without a human explanation behind it. You can have the same set of data and two entirely different explanations of what it means. When I give lectures on this, I use the little example of, suppose there's a young man and he's up in front of the magistrates and he's been charged with being part of a riot, and the proof is that he must have thrown a bottle at the police because the fragments of the bottle have his fingerprint. And there can be no debate about the fingerprint. It's forensically reliable. But you can just imagine a defence lawyer standing up and saying, well, this bottle did belong to my client. It was in a rubbish box outside his front gate, waiting for collection. The mob rushed past, they picked up the bottle. That's how his fingerprints came to be on the fragments of the bottle, and the prosecution will produce the opposite case. But it's the same single forensic fact of the fingerprint that has two entirely different interpretations. So that's where I think you have to, although you may think you've got hold of the facts, think about what interpretation you're putting on and why you're putting that interpretation. And is there perhaps some cognitive bias in your mind about as you interpret the information? That was the case with the before the invasion of Iraq, where pieces of information were available, but the interpretation given to them was the most malign in relation to Saddam Hussein, just because that's the way people thought about him. And I suppose the third point I would make is about those cognitive biases. We all suffer from them. I describe them as unconscious biases. And because they're unconscious, you don't know you're suffering from them. But other people will notice. And other people, if you share your work with them, might say, I think you're getting obsessed with this. Or this is groupthink. Just because the meeting all agreed that doesn't mean it's true. Think again. And there's some well-known cognitive biases which I describe in the book. Mirror imaging is a very common one, where you assume that your opponent thinks the same way as you do. And they may think very differently indeed, but you can easily fall into the trap of just assuming they are going to react to something the way you would react. And there are lots of historical examples of that. So these cognitive biases are always there. Nobody's entirely impartial, although we try to be. But that's where you've got to remember that this kind of analysis is a team sport.
Lastly, do you have any regrets in your life?
No.
And anything you would have changed?
In the course of work, there are always things. Mostly it's annoyance that I only discovered the crucial fact after, when it's too late. But no, you can only work on the information you have. You do your best to try and give advice based on, analyse it, give key judgments. And when I've been a policymaker, again, I've done my best to try and give rational, balanced policy advice in which you point out not just the most likely thing that might happen, but also the things which would be less likely but very damaging worthy to happen. And a good policymaker will take those into account too.
Sir David, thank you so much for taking the time out. It's lovely talking to you, and Thank you for coming to the studio and giving your time.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.